Hey guys, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I noticed that most of the audience today is from India, but there are people from outside India as well, rest of the world. We have people from Australia, Singapore, Middle East, UK, Jordan, Bulgaria, and the US. So it's a global audience today. Thank you so much for joining today's session. I really appreciate you taking the time. My name is Anupam Bonanthaya. I am the Chief Marketing Officer at Augis. We are a information risk management company. We help enterprises manage their information risk at a holistic level across data, software, systems, processes, and people. And today's session, we have our partner, Palameda. Palameda is an expert in open source software and managing the risk of open source software. We have Jeff Lush, who is the founder of Palameda, join us today. Palameda was recently acquired by Flexera Software, and they just completed the acquisition recently. And I welcome Jeff to the session. And before I hand it over to Jeff, a couple of housekeeping rules. Firstly, we have put all of you on mute to avoid background noise. Having said that, we do encourage you to ask questions and share your comments. You can do that via the chat session on your screen. So at any point, you can ask us questions or share your comments via the chat session. We have a Q&A session at the end of the slot, and we would make sure to answer all your questions in that slot. That's pretty much it. Again, I appreciate you joining this call. I know it's late in some places and early morning in some places, so please, thank you so much. Let me hand it over to Jeff with this. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me today. I appreciate that introduction. As said, my name is Jeff Lush. I'm the founder of Palameda, which is now part of Flexera Software. Very happy to join you today, and thank you so much for listening into my presentation. Today, I'm going to speak about open source adoption in the enterprise, ahead of the curve. And the purpose of today's talk is really to talk about how open source has appeared on the stage, how companies are using it, and how to best respect the open source community, the licenses, obligations, as well as any issues that may come up while you're using third-party content. Today's topics are going to talk about how companies use open source, how it comes into your organization, what types of things you can do to comply with these open source licenses, and what are some basics of an open source compliance program. So the thing that I always start with is something happened to how we build software. If you look back, is it 10 years? Is it 15 years? Is it 20 years ago? Something changed where how companies put together their software products. It used to be that you wrote pretty much every line of code yourself, or maybe you licensed a couple open source, quasi-open source components or commercial components. You got something from a book, but 90, 95, 99% of it was something that you or your developers wrote. Well, now if you look at what's going on, about half of the product that you ship is actually made up of third-party or open source code. The other half is your standard code that your developers wrote, but half of it came from someplace else. And if you look at the statistics, people are only aware about 2% of what they're actually using. If you ask a typical software company to make a list of the open source and commercial code that they're using, they can't really do that. And this is because of the explosion of open source and the change in how we create these software packages. We don't know what we're using. Is basically what I hear over and over and over again when I talk to companies who are saying, how do we manage this problem? So if you look back 5 or 6 years, and Palameda and Flexera has this information, we can look and see what a typical software product look like. Many people come to us and say, please do a review, please help us understand what's going on. And one of the first things that we ask them is, what open source commercial code are you using? Where did it come from? What is its names? What is its versions? If you look back in 2011, the typical software company would have about 18 disclosed items, and we would find 135 libraries when all was said and done, which means they knew about 13% of the third-party code they were using. If you flash forward here to 2016, the typical software product we look at is 560 open source libraries, and the disclosure rate is only about 27, which is about 4% disclosure. Basically, that's it's not 1 in 10, it's not 1 in 20. It's basically very close to 0. And if you ask people, are you confident in that list? They'll laugh and say, no, of course not. We know there's a lot more there. That's why we're talking to you. That's why we're trying to figure out what's going on. And you can see from the graph here, basically the disclosure rate has remained pretty low, while the use of open source has increased dramatically. So what's happening? What changed? Well, first off, there's a lot more real open source usage out there. Executives at companies have really changed. They've said, we want you to use open source. The old rule 10, 15 years ago was no open source, we're too scared, we don't know what's coming in. New rules are please use open source, save us money, go get things we don't have to build, go get the best of breed open source libraries that are out there. So the executives have basically said, please use open source. There's also a lot larger systems in use. If we look back at 2011, if we look back at 2000, small products, maybe desktop apps, standalone, single executables, not a lot of third-party IT dependencies. And now people are shipping embedded devices with entire operating systems as just one small part of what goes out the door. There's multiple IT service systems required now, a database, obviously, a queue, front-end load balancers, and so on and so on and so on. These are very large systems. There's many small packages in some languages. So if you go look at your use of jQuery, you may find dozens of tiny little packages there. Or if you're using Node Package Manager in the JavaScript world now, you may have hundreds of items, all very, very small and providing a single service, but many, many, many of them, hundreds, sometimes even thousands. People are also using what's called package managers. So you may be familiar with names such as Maven or NuGet or Node Package Managers we just talked about. And this has made it very easy to increase your dependency on open source. You can simply type a name and a version, and it will bring in that library and all its dependencies at build time. And a single request may end up bringing in dozens of dependencies. And it's not always clear what those dependencies are. We also see a lot more use of containers, virtual machines, custom Linux distributions, especially in the embedded and IoT space. And that makes it so that maybe your small app, maybe it's only doing 1 or 2 things. It may depend on an entire operating system, which has dozens, hundreds, thousands of dependencies. So at the heart of it, there's a lot more open source being used. We also see that companies require more analysis. They need a better picture of what's going on. Maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you could get away with saying, oh yeah, here's our list of 10 or 20 items, and the people you're giving it to would believe it. Well, people are doing checks now. They know if you're giving you an IoT system with Linux in it and they don't disclose Linux or BusyBox, there's a problem. So more analysis is required. The level of expected analysis is deeper, especially when you look at the IT systems or the operating systems if they're involved. There's definitely more awareness of full dependencies. People say, what database do you use? What queue do you use? I need to know that. I need to understand what's going on. The legal teams are also able to handle a lot more. They've educated themselves, and they understand what's involved here, and they've done a couple of these cycles. They're asking for more. They're able to handle more of the real set of dependencies. And we also see that the commercial supply chain is no longer trusted. It used to be that you would get an SDK or a library from a commercial partner, and just be treated as a single line item. Now people are looking at it and saying, I bet you there's dozens or hundreds or sometimes even thousands of open source libraries hidden inside of that SDK. And it's important because once you start using that SDK, you're responsible for the compliance to that open source. So all of these things together mean that we're seeing more open source and are expected to report on more of the open source that does exist. So how does this get into your company? Well, obviously, the first thing is your developers go out and they say, I want to use a library. They go out, they use a search engine. Maybe they type in a specific component name or library name. Maybe they type in a type of component like open source database or XML processor, and then they get some answers and they click and they pick the best one. That's the classic case. We also see cases where open source software arrives via your commercial dependencies, your SDKs. Somebody gives you a zip file download, or they give you an installer and you install it. Next thing you know, you have a gigabyte of dependencies, and you're treating it as a single line item, but it actually contains a lot of open source. We see in the IoT and embedded space entire complex operating systems, whether it's open source like Linux, BSD, Android, ECOS, maybe commercial things like Windows and others. We see that IT goes out and selects open source components for the infrastructure. So maybe it's an open source database like MySQL, or a web server like Apache HTTP daemon or Nginx, OpenSpace, OpenStack, Docker, etc. Those are all things that IT, not just development, but IT may be pulling in as part of the systems. You acquire another company, and they bring in all of their open source and all their dependencies as well. And then you may be running an open source project yourself, and there may be contributions that are coming in from the outside world. All of these things are entry points for third-party and open source software to come into your organization. So how do people manage it? Well, right now, most people are not doing much to manage. They really depend on self-reporting. So what we sometimes call that inbound registrations of open source packages that are being used. That may be as simple as an email, maybe a magical spreadsheet that people pass around or they check into someplace. But you usually don't see more than a couple percentage points of disclosures in those cases, even in companies where they try to do a good job and they really build it into their culture. You just don't see a lot of registrations there. You'll see companies start to do some scans. So maybe they'll use something like grep or a text search to say, let me go find copyright statements. Let me go find the magic words that are the names of certain open source licenses that you might want to track. And so those do some quick scans to make sure that they're seeing what's going on there. They may do a deep, what we call pedigree scan, or a deep scan of packages to make sure that they like all the lines of code that are coming in. So you bring in a library. Do I see any licenses in those libraries that are contrary to my policy, meaning things that I'm not allowed to use for whatever reason? You may do deep scans before things leave your door. If you release open source yourself, you may do some deep scans. You may do M&A audits. When you buy a company, you may want to check and say, what's coming in the door when we bought this company? It's now our code. Let's make sure it's up to our standards. And then if you work with commercial and OEM partners, it's important to have them disclose and comply with open source usage. So if they're giving you code and it turns out it's a black box and it turns out to be full of open source that they didn't disclose, people are pushing back and saying, you really need to comply with these licenses. If you want me to use your project, I need to know that you're doing the right thing, therefore I can do the right thing. These are all ways that companies track and manage their open source right now. Most companies are not doing all of these things. They're adding them slowly to the processes and the procedures that they follow. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that happens today. So you can't boil the ocean. That is a thing that we say over and over again when we talk about compliance, when we talk about open source management. And so companies right now have a lot of technical debt. They've built products 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where they have not done the proper analysis and management. So very often they're going to come in and do a quick overview audit. Let's find some big rocks. Let's create a high-level bill of materials, also known as a BOM, B-O-M. What are some things? What is the application server we're using? Are we using any cryptography? Do we have certain components like zlib that we always know are going to be there and our customers expect? That'll give you some very quick hits. You'll find some things that are problematic, and it's a great place to start. And then people go to a deeper level, like a detailed overview, and then finally to a full, where they've looked at all the third-party content that's there, both in source and binary form. They've looked for places where things have been cut and pasted and brought in. And that's how you can get to a full bill of materials, a full disclosure list. And this is something often known as a level of analysis. Most companies want to get to the place where they're at 100% of analysis, but it can take a while, especially at a large company, to get to that place. And it is something that people roll out slowly. They learn a lot about doing this type of analysis. They learn a lot about how to do this management. And I highly recommend that you plan to start slowly, you do all the right things, and you expect this to take a little while as you bring in the procedures and policies that you can manage as time goes on. So let's talk a little bit about what these open source licenses mean. You know, you're at this talk, so obviously you have an interest, and you may be familiar with this already. But one of the things I find is that most developers have very little knowledge of what the licenses are and what they mean. Management has very little knowledge as well, and even some of the lawyers are not really familiar with what these licenses are. So I strongly recommend education around these licenses. I strongly recommend even management and legal to go out and get some more training on these things so you can make the right decisions. So pretty much all open source licenses have obligations. This basically means the author of this project says, you know, you can use my library. You don't have to email me. You don't have to call me on the phone. You just have to follow these obligations. If I say, just give me credit in your about box and you can use my library, the expectation is you're gonna follow the rules and put the person's maybe copyright statement or name in your about box and documentation, and everybody's happy. You've complied with the license. Many open source licenses actually have a pretty long list of obligations, things you need to do in order to legally and properly use those libraries. So one of the big confusion points here is that people hear the words free software or free, and they think that there's no obligations. They think that there's no cost. There's nothing they need to do except just download it and use it. And so it's really important to understand that free may mean there's no cost, but it doesn't mean that there's no obligations. You'll always hear people say free as in speech, not free as in beer, meaning you have freedoms, but it's not that it's just free and there's nothing else you need to do. So they have a list of obligations you have to use, have to follow in order to legally use the open source library, and that's the heart of this talk today. Many developers incorrectly believe that they can just download it and use it, or if there is no license that they see, they have complete permission to use it. And it's actually, in most places in the world, completely the opposite. You have to have explicit permission. You have to have the list of obligations and follow them to be in compliance and do the right thing. And that's what people do when they say, I'm in compliance with the OSS licenses, or I'm doing license compliance tasks. And the idea is following those obligations. And your compliance actions depend on how you're using them. If you're shipping software versus doing software as a service, you may have different obligations. And most licenses have multiple obligations. It's not just a simple give credit where credit's due. So what are the things that you can do to comply? So the licenses that you may use are going to ask for many different types of obligations. One of the biggest ones that are out there talks about sharing source code. And for many commercial companies, this is why they're concerned about open source compliance. There are licenses that are out there that say if you use code under this license and you distribute it to your users or your customers, the expectation is that you're going to share the source code for the entire product with the people you distribute it to. And for many commercial companies or companies who are making proprietary software, that's against their business model. They can't comply with that request. And the important thing is, don't use code that requires that if you're not willing to follow that obligation. So you'll hear people talk about this. This is known as copyleft, or in some cases they call it viral licenses, viral licensing. Not a big fan of that phrase, but it's something that you'll see out there. The official term that people like to use is copyleft, meaning you need to share the source code, sometimes small pieces, sometimes all of it, depends on the license. But it's one of the more concerning obligations that commercial companies have because they're not always able to respect it. One of the most common obligations is giving credit. That's known as giving a notice or an attribution in some cases. So maybe the name of the author needs to be reported in the about box, maybe the documentation, maybe even out on a website. There's others that are there as well. Maybe you have to share patents. Maybe you have to restrict use. That's not officially open source if you restrict use, but it's often in the licenses that you may come across as you're doing this type of review. So sometimes there's restrictions on military use, not for military use. Maybe it's not for use in avionics or airplanes or nuclear facilities. Maybe in certain countries it's not allowed, or maybe you're not allowed to use it for commercial purposes. It's a very common restriction we see in some code. There may be some vanity or one-off licenses. The classic one here says, give me a free beer, maybe say a prayer or do no evil if you use this library. These are sometimes slightly weird. This guy a beer, do we have to actually say a prayer? But you will see this pretty much in every code base. There'll be a couple of these so-called vanity licenses. And all the way down, you're also going to find commercial licenses. Our classic commercial dependencies are there. We very often talk about open source reviews and open source licenses. Maybe 10 to 15% of the content that you're going to find is actually commercially licensed that you just didn't know was being used there. When we talk about the open source world, there's typically two universes that we see people work in. The first one is that copyleft or viral universe, a philosophy that says we expect you to release source code. And it may be all of the code, like under the general public license, one of the most famous copyleft licenses that are out there, and one of the famous licenses in general, which says you must supply all the source code if you link against this GPL code, and then you distribute the product. There's a slightly weaker copyleft license called the LGPL, or the lesser general public license, that basically says you must supply source code to the library, and only the library, if you link against that and make a distribution. So the philosophy there is make that library source code available, make your changes available, make all updates public so people can make that library better and better. Doesn't typically talk about your product or your code base at all, as long as you do the right thing around that library and license. Very popular license. You also will see in some cases the Affero general public license, known as the AGPL. This has been a kind of a reaction to the use of software as a service. It basically says if you're building a website and you do certain actions on this library, you should be giving the source code away to the people that are coming to you through the network. And that's not a very commonly used license these days, but we see it in some very important products, especially in the database space. It should be on top of mind for you. So those are the most common copyleft licenses that almost certainly you will see in your product or in your time as in the technology field. You'll also see what's known as permissive licenses. So BSD license, MIT license, the Apache software license, typically require notices maybe in an about box or the documentation or preserved in the source code or in a notice file. Usually pretty easy to comply with, though it's been my experience that most companies are out of compliance with these licenses. They haven't done the right thing around the about boxes, etc. You'll see these other licenses. We talked about the free beer, the vanity, etc. Things to be aware of. Almost certainly you'll find a handful, 1, 2, or 3 of these in your code base if it's of any size. So why do you need a license? Well, first off, copyright law says you need to. All source code is explicitly copyrighted, and the original author owns it. And they're the only people that can give you permission to use it, especially as a commercial company. And you have no rights to use other people's code without their permission. As we talked about before, open source is the license is the way to give permission to use this source code. And if you're using a library that does not have a license in it, that's a sign of a lack of maturity for that project. And it may be a sign of other problems. Maybe that nobody else has ever used it commercially. Nobody's ever complained that there's no license there. And I would say it's not open source if you don't have a license. It might be visible source. You can look at it. But without a license, you should not be using it for commercial purposes. There are some misunderstandings that you'll see in your enterprise, your company. People will get code, and they'll grab it, and they'll use it, even if it doesn't have a license. So freely available is not open source. You'll also hear people say public domain, and it has a very specific meaning. But people will sometimes use the word public domain when they really mean open source or free software, or public domain means I found it on the internet. So we really want to try to use public domain only in the cases where the original author has really declared something to be public domain. Or maybe the resource is so old that it has fallen into the public domain, which is very rare to see in the technology space. And it's important to realize that you have a compliance path even if you don't ship your product. If you're a software as a service company, you still have compliance around FARO. You still have compliance around commercial licenses, maybe in your JavaScript and front end, maybe concerns around vulnerability. And there is a belief that commercially licensed code has no open source obligations, and that's not true. Basically, if you're grabbing somebody else's commercial code, almost certainly it contains dozens or hundreds of open source components that you should be respecting as well as you pass it on. So what does compliance look like? Well, when you are shipping a product and you are compliant with the open source licenses, you should be doing these types of actions. You should have copyright notices in your about box and your documentation. You should pass along the license texts, as appropriate to your users. Make sure you provide the source code for all the copyleft style components that you use. Mark your changes if you've made some changes. Pay patent licensing for the commercial patents that you may need to license, and so on and so on. These are the type of things, if you're running a software company, you should be looking and saying, are we doing these things? And if you're not, it's a pretty good sign that you're out of compliance. I always like looking at projects that are out there in the wild as good examples of compliance. So Firefox, the browser that's out there, a lot of people, if not everybody, has this on their desktop. If you go to the About box for Firefox, you will see a button there that says licensing information. And if you click on this, it'll give you a list of the open source libraries that are used. It'll give you links to the license text, and so on and so on. This is, I think, a really good way of showing off compliance in a very visible place. It's kind of the expected place for it. And I think Firefox has done a pretty good job of making it approachable to even end users. They also do a good job about providing the source code for the copyleft component. So if you go out to their website, they actually have these links where you can get the source code for the pieces that have copyleft licenses. This is not as user-friendly as their About box, but it's still nice because it's complying with the copyleft. So as I said before, how you deliver your code may affect your obligations. So if you're doing software as a service, you may have fewer obligations because many of the open source licenses only come into effect with a distribution versus a shipping product. If you put something on a CD and you mail it to people, that's a distribution. If you have an embedded device or an IoT device, that's a distribution, and you may be more on the hook for following the open source obligations than you would be in the SaaS world. You may be producing your own embedded Linux system, especially in the case of embedded devices, versus just having an application that happens to run on Linux. There's probably different levels of compliance required in those worlds. You may have a client piece that goes out in the world, but a server piece that lives on your machines. So these are all things that when you look at how your product is used, how your product is distributed, you're probably going to find different places where you have different compliance needs. And it's really important for the legal team, the engineering team, the management team to really understand how your product is built and distributed and used by your end users. One thing that we say is compliance often requires remediation. Remediation is just a fancy word for fixing things. There was a problem and it needs to be fixed in some way. So you may find all of these things in your project. You may find monolithic source trees, copyright statements, open source license blocks, and so on and so on. These are all indicators that you're using open source. And you may be starting from a basis of really having no understanding, no list of open source that's there. Go through this list. Basically, look at all these different places that are screaming out third-party ownership, third-party dependencies, and start doing the right thing around obligations, doing the right thing around compliance. And all of these are open source components. All of these things are going to be found. And the things at the top are going to be easier to find than the things at the bottom. At the bottom, things like cutting and pasting or a couple lines of code borrowed, stolen, copied, whatever you want to call it, from an open source library. That's a lot harder to find as opposed to a big directory that says zlib or OpenSSL. And you will find new libraries, probably 10 times or 100 times what you knew already. So as you do this task, as you figure out what you have, you're going to find some problems. And you should just be ready to find serious problems. This has been my experience over the last decade, that anytime somebody looks, they're going to find a problem and have to fix it. And typically what people find are violations like GPL violations, commercial violations where they didn't forget, they forgot to pay or they never paid for a library. And also vulnerabilities, which has become really important in the last 2 years to be aware of your open source vulnerabilities, basically bugs that led to security issues in those libraries. And in many cases, as you find these things, you need to fix them. And it may be found before you release, and you can fix it before you release, or it may be found in the field after you've already released. And that's very common for vulnerabilities, that a library was great when you shipped it, but people found attacks on it after it was out there for a few months or a few years, and now you have something that you have to fix. So let's talk about how companies do this day after day after day. Many companies right now are starting from basically a green field, meaning they haven't done anything, they're looking for processes, they're looking for procedures. They very often are going to start with maybe a first scan or a first audit and figure out what's going on, do the remediation, fix things, and then maybe start thinking about building a process around this. And it is very much a circular process where you figure out what's right for your company, you create a policy, you write your code, you figure out what's going on there, you review any of the requests, you use it, you figure out what your compliance tasks are, you comply with those, fix those issues, and then you find that there's more new policy that has to be made. And I think one of the most common mistakes that people make is they think that they can get their policy right the first time. They spend hours, days, months trying to make the perfect policy. And then they tell their developers, and they start looking and they figure out they missed all these things. So my recommendation is to get a good enough policy, a pretty basic policy that's out there, because you're going to be surprised about what you find. And a lot of times the more difficult compliance issues are from licenses or ways of using the code that you couldn't even think of before you started looking what the problems may be. Important thing, I think, is to create clear, dynamic, and enforced policies. And what that means is clear is that everybody knows that there's a policy. They're trained on it at least once a year, not just when they're joining the job and they're overwhelmed with their sign-on papers and 401k and retirement plan. Really, once a year, you should be telling people, here's what our policy is, here's what our expectations are. And also that those policies should be very easy to find. Sometimes they exist inside of tools, sometimes they exist in a wiki or in a PDF or an Excel document, but they should be very easy. Anybody writing software for your organization should be able to get that almost instantly. And they're dynamic, which means they change when you find new use cases, when you use new libraries or licenses. And they're enforced. Don't ship products if people are not doing the right thing. If they're not respecting the open source licenses, why are you thinking about shipping that product? Just like if you found one of your customers was using your product without paying for it, you'd be pretty upset. You'd wonder how could they even work as a business by not complying with your licensing? We should really treat the open source world the same way. But if we can't comply with their licenses, let's not use their code. So what should we know in order to set these policies? Well, first off, just like we talked about before, you should know what type of product you're building. You should know how your users get it, how they install it, how they use it. You should know all these moving pieces. You should also be aware of your dependencies out there on the internet, like web services or third-party companies whose data you may be using. And it's not just a simple picture. Very often when you are building a modern software product or software company in 2016, there's many, many layers at work. So if you're looking at something that's running on top of Linux, or you're making an embedded device or IoT, you may have all these layers at work. Your product is that yellow box at the top where all the things that you've done to comply all live up there. But you may be depending on other external applications, other system frameworks and libraries, drivers, the Linux kernel, the firmware, etc. These are all things that you should have at least a passive understanding of why they're there, how you're using them. You should draw diagrams like this with your team and say, let's talk about our dependencies. Do we build our own operating system? Do we depend on one? Do we require additions on those operating systems in order to work? What about out there on the internet? Are we using web services? Are we using third-party products, REST interfaces? Are we getting data from these organizations? Are we sending our user data there as well? There's big privacy implications for using third-party services. All of these things wrapped together allow you to start making good policy. Other things you should be aware of, do you have a large patent portfolio? Does your company have a huge patent wall? And if so, there are certain licenses and libraries that you may not want to use, or you may need to be very careful because they may have things like patent grants or patent retaliation clauses, which says you can't sue them for patent infringement if you're using their open source. And maybe you would never do that. We should at least be mindful and be aware of what agreements you've signed up for. You should understand how your product is linked. That is some magic words that we could probably spend hours talking about, but how the libraries connect together, how the operating system and your product connect together, because that can really affect your license situation, especially if you're in the embedded space or if you're doing something really interesting with Linux and the kernel and drivers. Do you use somebody else's SDK? Do you really understand the licensing there? It's very common these days to find SDKs that are actually open source and sometimes even GPL, a very strong copyleft license. But people misunderstand and they think, well, we must have paid money for this. It's a commercial company's code, when in fact it's a strong copyleft license that you need to be very mindful that you're doing the right thing around. So you definitely should be increasing your inbound awareness of licensing. So attending sessions like this are very helpful, but also doing this type of education internally, I think, is the only way that companies are going to be able to manage this process. So always encourage your programmers to look and ask for the license for the open source project. You know, they should know how to look for licenses. There's certain places where they are. If there's no license and they still think it's a good library, maybe log a bug. Show them where the licensing is going to be, have them ask those questions, and ask explicit questions of your developers. Ask them about what the GPL means. Ask them what the LGPL means. You're very often going to find that they have wrong information or folklore about these licenses, and they're making business decisions for you with the wrong information. So retrain them about what these licenses, especially the strong licenses, what they mean. And then log bugs. 90% of open source authors will pick a license when prompted. So if you like the library but they just lack a license, log a bug and tell them the type of license you'd love to see. If you're an MIT shop or an Apache 2.0 shop, suggest, hey, we'd love to use it. Any chance of getting this under an MIT license or an Apache 2.0 license? Very often the library authors will comply with your request. So set up a process to discover and manage your use of open source. So some really easy ways to get started. Get people together. I call it the conference room effect. This is a great way. Get people in the room, whether it's really in the room or virtually in the room, and start asking questions. Like, what databases do we use? What encryption libraries do we use? What's our data? What's our application server strategy? And so on and so on. Do we use jQuery? Are there plugins that we use? It's very, very common that you'll ask people, are we using any open source? No. Well, what database are we using? Oh, we're using MySQL, which is an open source database. So you sometimes have to ask these questions a couple different ways to get the real answer. Check with your commercial people to get your full list of commercial licenses. Do your classic code reviews, security reviews. Do use a product like Palomida's or Flexera's OSS code scans. Keep scanning. That's a great way to obviously get closer to 100% analysis. So one of the last couple of things I'd like to talk about is around vulnerability and vulnerability management. Many people come to this world because they need to comply with the open source licenses. As a company, they do the right thing. They respect the libraries and the licenses in the open source world they're using. Other times they're brought here because they're very concerned around security. They're using open source libraries that end up having security holes, and their product ends up being vulnerable or broken because of it. So in the last year or two, we've seen more and more very high profile open source related vulnerabilities. The one that everybody remembers is Heartbleed, which was back toward the tail end of 2014. And what's amazing about Heartbleed is that we still find it. So we find the versions of OpenSSL that was vulnerable to Heartbleed, as reported in April of 2014, now more than 2 years ago. We still find that in the field, in shipping products. And if you remember how crazy those couple of weeks were when everybody was trying to figure out, were they using this version, how do they fix it, how do they upgrade it? These are all companies that somehow slipped through that craziness. Maybe they looked, maybe they didn't find it, maybe they didn't even pay attention to it. And it's very common to find things like old versions of OpenSSL or old versions of Tomcat, etc. And you just need to get on top of that. Look at code bases that nobody's ever examined these things for. If you find Heartbleed, that's almost like certainly a case where nobody's ever looked at this code base for vulnerabilities. Look inside the binary libraries that you're getting from your commercial partners. A very common place to find things like OpenSSL and zlib that have old versions that have not been upgraded. You may be getting precompiled open source from outside the organization, maybe through RPMs or Maven or NuGet. Probably going to find them inside there as well. Maybe large open source components, somebody gave you this huge tree that ended up aging out. And then stale containers or virtual machines. It's very common that people put together a virtual machine 5 years ago and they just let it running. But they never upgraded it. They never ran patches on it. And it was great when they shipped it. It's now 5 years old, which is forever in the operating system world. And what's great is that the impact of Heartbleed really increased reviews of other open source components. We're seeing more and more people doing deep dives. We're seeing more and more people doing kind of interesting attacks. And I think the whole security world is getting better before it, but we're still finding a lot of content out there. So when you are looking out there for vulnerabilities, there's some really good and common places that you can look. In the perfect world, you have a full listing of all your open source. You've got a great bill of materials, but we live in the real world. Very often you have to do a targeted attack. You have to do a phased approach to discovering where open source is. And here's some places that I recommend to do some of your first searches. Well, first off, if you know you have cryptographic components, start looking there. If you have a big third-party directory and it says OpenSSL, or you see the word crypto somewhere in a package name, or if you do a big grep and big string search and you see the word cryptography or crypto someplace, great place to start your search there. These things are often highly targeted by attackers. They have often legal tracking requirements for export anyway, open source obligations and so on, but your customers really expect you to be using good, secure cryptography. And if you're not, it's a sign that the rest of the product is probably has serious problems as well. We also look at compression components. zlib is one that you've heard me talk a lot about. Great component, probably one of the most popular open source libraries that are out there. But over the years, it's had some vulnerabilities. It's a great place to check. Compression and decompression is, again, often very highly targeted because any attacker out there knows that anything that gets run through the system probably is going to be basically decompressed at some point to be viewed. This is a common attack on things like email systems. A common attack on like virus scanners is because they know that any zip file that's going to come through has to be peeked and looked at. That's a great time to exercise a vulnerability in a compression component. Multimedia components, so anything dealing with video, audio, very widely used, often written in languages that may have maybe harder security problems to fix. So, and then themselves contains crypto and compression routines. So kind of a triple whammy there. So common cases, things like this FFmpeg, they're MPEG and audio related items. Great place to look because of all these subcomponents that may be there. The application platforms like Tomcat and others, very widely used, very widely targeted because they're so commonly used. So you might see more vulnerabilities there. And it doesn't mean that there's worse programmers or worse code there. It just means that there's been a lot of eyeballs on it. There's been a lot of attacks, because if you do get an attack, it'll be very successful across the world. You will see databases, same issue. And you'll see the operating systems in the Linux stack. Again, because it's so common to find these things. If you find a good attack, you pretty much can go anywhere to get in. These are great places to start. You shouldn't finish there because there's the whole rest of the world to look at. But if you're going to start, some places are where I recommend. So with that, I'm at the end of my presentation here. I have my contact information. Please don't hesitate to go take a look at our website. Palameda.com will bring you directly to our product. FlexeraSoftware.com will take you to our new home. My email is here. Please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. Also, please follow us on Twitter. We love our followers and answering questions that we get there as well. So thank you again for today's presentation and attending, and I look forward to your questions and speaking with you.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a pretty comprehensive and nice presentation. We do have many questions. I've been consolidating them and trying to organize them in an order to see how to go about it in a logical way. Let me start asking those questions. Firstly, what about OpenStack on cloud? I mean, what are the do's and don'ts from an open source perspective when you're dealing with cloud?
That's great. So, great question there. And I see two parts there. One is using a technology like OpenStack, which is a great project, so many people working on it, so many companies working on it, but also very complicated. It's a fast-moving ecosystem. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of subcomponents. So when I work with our customers who are managing that, it's important to know that when you're in a fast-moving community, you're probably going to have changes in compliance needs more than if you're in a more mature community. You may have more vulnerabilities because, again, it's a fast-moving community. Lots of code is being written. A lot of new components are being added, etc. This kind of, when you look at your open source that you're using, that might be someplace that you do spend more time managing and keeping track of, because it is going to be updated so often, and it may have more compliance needs than others because it's so large. The second half of that question is about being in the cloud. So if you're in the cloud, you may find yourself not doing a classic distribution. And what's great about that, if you're talking about compliance, is you may not have as many compliance tasks to follow. You may not need to have to put things in your about box or your documentation as much as if you were actually doing a distribution. Though what we do see there is that vulnerabilities become very important. So you end up doing the same level of analysis because you need to know what libraries you're using in order to get a good vulnerability statement. And people's business models also change. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to companies who they said, we were going to be in the cloud forever, and then our biggest customer said that we had to do an on-prem version for security, and now we're in trouble because we had picked all these viral/copyleft libraries, and now we have to do a distribution. What do we do? How do we find it? How do we fix it? So really good question there, kind of the two parts that I think really hit on the modern open source world and our modern distribution methods. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Jeff. There's a related question. I think you already answered part of it, but let me reiterate this question. What if we are shipping our products as a SaaS or a PaaS solution? How is it different, and how does it compare with an on-prem delivery?
Sure. So for on-prem, a classic distributed application, there's a lot of compliance tasks. Pretty much all the open source licenses say, if you do a distribution, here's what you have to do. Here's my obligations you have to follow. If you're in a SaaS or a PaaS world, you may not be doing a classic distribution. So you may not have all those obligations to follow. But as I said in the previous question, we do see a lot of companies who are still doing the same level of bill of materials management because they need to know their vulnerability situation. And they also want to be prepared in case they ever turn into on-prem. especially if you're a smaller or medium-sized company and you may get acquired by a larger company, they may come in and change your business model. SaaS was fine for you when you were small, but now that you've been acquired, you now need to be on-prem for other people. And it's a very common thing that things that were born as SaaS become on-prem, but after some pain, because if you didn't plan on becoming on-prem, it's very difficult to become on-prem because you've probably made some license choices or components choices that would prevent you from doing that. You have to do some rework to get compliant. I'll add one more thing there, which is on the SaaS side, you still may have some compliance tasks, even if you decide you're not going to do, you're not doing a distribution, you're not going to follow those obligations, and maybe security is not as big deal for you for whatever reason. You still may have some things that your lawyers may tell you you have some compliance tasks for. Maybe your web front end, maybe your mobile apps like your iPhone app or an Android app. Those may be things that you think of yourself as a SaaS company, but you may have parts of your product that are actually distributed to your users, or you may consider them a distribution. Those are some things that you may want to track down and then do a deeper dive on those pieces, even in the SaaS situation.
Thanks. Okay, next thing is an interesting question. So what do we do if it's a copy-paste code? I'm not using the libraries, but I'm copying and pasting from something. What are the implications, and how do I go about it?
Sure. And it's a very common thing to see. There's a lot of open source forums that are out there where people ask questions and they say, how do I do this? And somebody gives you the code, and you cut and paste it into the product that you're working on, and you ship it. And then you only find out later that that actually has some obligations. Maybe it was cut and pasted from the Linux kernel, or maybe it came from another open source library. So we talked about policy before. I think it's always great to have a clear policy around cutting and pasting. How do you properly mark those cut and pastes? How do you put in the license information as necessary? And that's great for moving forward. But for the case where it's already been done, well, first off, you want to find out where that is. In many cases, it's a simple accounting thing. Come in and put the right license in, put the right obligation and credits in the about box as necessary, mark it up so you know where their code starts and your code begins. That's a great place. You may find yourself having to do some remediation if you end up using licenses that you can't comply with. And in many cases in the cut and paste world, we find that there's no clear license. The original author never even thought about code reuse. But we know from previous slides here is that if you don't have a license, you really probably can't use it commercially. So a great place at that point, if you can track it down where it came from, maybe go talk to that original author and ask for a license or suggest a license. But also bearing in mind that they may not pick the license that is good for your organization. You know, they might love the copyleft licenses, but you've cut and pasted it to the heart of your system. So good thing to know. Try to have your developers understand the right way to do cutting and pasting, right way to give credit, and then at a certain point you may find yourself have to remediate some of the old choices.
Jeff, you talked about policy, compliance, and remediation. So who does what? I mean, whose neck do we choke? So if you
Yeah.
in an organization, I mean, who is responsible for what?
So you will find that often that this is a shared responsibility. It's rare that there's only one person or organization that says, do this, do this, do this, do this. And even in cases where you're lucky enough to have, say, a dedicated legal team, security team, architecture team, development team, VP of product, etc., very often they're going to get together and they're going to know little bits of it, and they have to share their knowledge. So it's very common for a legal team, whether it's inside or outside, to set your policy. It's very common for the security team to set policy around the use of vulnerable components and how they manage them and how they use them. It's very common for the VP of engineering or product manager to be responsible for compliance. In many organizations, they actually have that person sign a document that says, you know, when we shipped our software, it was compliant with our obligations. And then the developers are kind of responsible for following the rules, raising their hand when they know that there's something that may need to be open source compliance around, or answering questions about how things are linked or used or distributed. And it's very common to get everybody together. Some organizations put together what's called an open source review board, which is made of representatives from all these organizations who sit together and basically solve the problems of the universe, set policy, deal with new questions, talk about compliance, talk about weird cases or things that they didn't think about to set new policies. That's the perfect world. In many cases, you find that the line level developers end up having to do a lot of this themselves, and that some managers are better than others. So you may find different levels of compliance in a real organization, especially the larger that you are. But if you can, try to do education, try to put in kind of that virtual cycle of setting policy, writing code, checking policy, enforcing, and updating your policy. Lather, rinse, repeat over and over again.
Okay. You talked about remediation. So what is the cost of remediation? How long it takes typically, and what is involved in the remediation process? Because we know most of things are not compliant, and you need to adhere to compliance. So if I need to get down the remediation path, how does it take? How does it go?
Sure. So some remediation is pretty easy. The easiest remediation is you find a problem and it turns out you're not even compiling that into your product. It's just dead code. Delete it. Figure out that it's not supposed to be there and you delete it. That's the easiest compliance. That's what people always want to find out when they say, oh, we have this horrible violation. Oh, we're not even linking it. We're not even shipping it. Just delete it. So you will find a bunch of just delete it style compliance or remediation that's out there. Another pretty straightforward remediation is coming into compliance with the attribution style or the permissive licenses, where you need to put copyrights and license text, things like that, in your about box. Pretty straightforward. It may be a lot of work, but it's pretty straightforward. We see people not really as worried about that. Maybe they should be, but it's kind of seen as sometimes a bookkeeping exercise. Oh, we're using this. Let's come into compliance. Let's put the right information in our about box and documentation. The harder types of remediation are cases where you have things such as commercial compliance. Sometimes it's pretty easy and pretty inexpensive to buy a commercial license, but sometimes you find out that the license is so expensive it really breaks your business model. You're shipping hundreds of thousands of instances, maybe embedded devices or things like that, and the royalty cost for this commercial library is more than your profit margin on the device. That's a difficult remediation because you're already shipping it. It's already out in the field. Now what do you do? You may have a similar situation in the open source world where maybe your whole product is based around some use of Linux or the Linux kernel, and it's linked in a certain way that you can't just undo that. You just can't remediate very easily, especially if people have found that problem and kind of shown it to the world that you have this issue. So much like all defects, it's so much cheaper to fix it before you ship. If you can find it and fix it before you ship, maybe you missed your date, and there's a cost to that, but it's so much better to do that than it is to, say, have a installed base of devices that you have to recall, or you have to have a kind of your hands are tied when it comes to remediation. So good to know what you're shipping, good to know it before you ship it if you can. Some features. Sometimes you may need to pay some patent royalties. Not really an open source issue, but it does come up with some of the open source libraries that have patent royalties required, like some of the MPEG players and things like that. So these are all things that are part of remediation. And there's not a one-size-fits-all remediation plan for people, but very often people are going to look and say, well, what happens if we have a vulnerability? How do we handle that right now? A lot of those same procedures can be used for any of your open source management remediations.
Okay. You talked about open source review board. So what comes, this is a typical chicken and egg question. What comes first? Does the review board come first or the tools come first? What do you recommend?
It depends on the organizations. Some organizations love coming in and bringing tools with just one person saying, let's find out what's going on in our company, and then let's build the right open source review board based on what we find. That's a very common thing to see. Other times you'll get either a real open source review board or a quasi open source review board. And in some ways it's in name only. It's, hey, here's the lawyer, here's the security person, here's the VP of engineering. We're going to call ourselves an open source review board, but in some ways it's almost just like an email alias. But it's good to get that team together and to say, what are we worried about? Let's have a place to talk about these things. And I see it's almost a coin flip. What type of organizations that are out there? There might be people in their silos saying, let's get a tool in, figure out what's going on, and then react. There's other times people already have a mature OSRB or a quasi OSRB. They say, we're ready to deal with whatever we find already. We have the right people together. Let's go start finding things that we have to comply with.
Okay.
And I think what I was going to say, one last thing on that is company size definitely affects that. Geographic locations, if you're very spread out around the world, you may be more likely to have an OSRB because you're already somewhat virtual, and you may need to kind of set policy for the worldwide development, documenting things so you know what the right thing to do. So in those cases, I would recommend an OSRB.
Okay. Next question is about the tools. So what are the tools out there? Of course, Palameda is a good example. So what are the tools out there, and how do they compare?
Mm-hmm. So there are definitely other tools that are out there. I would say you might want to look at what's called SCA tools. You may want to look at open source discovery tools. There's some that are open source. There's some that are commercial. I think different organizations can have different needs. Some of these tools require you uploading code to another organization. That may not fly at some companies. It may be perfectly acceptable for others. Some tools only do very high-level analysis. So great quick results, but they may not let you go and do deep dives. And some companies may be happy. They might say, I don't want to know what's going on deep in my code base. Others are going to say, well, I want quick results, but I also want to be able to go deep as necessary. I would look also in the type of world that you live in. If you are in a Java shop, there may be some tools that have more of a Java bent. If you're in a .NET shop as well. And those are all things I think as you go out and you look at this basically component management space that'll help you make a decision. Some of these tools have workflow. So before you decide to use an open source library, you can make a request to use it. Others are just pure scanning. Others don't actually scan the source code. They just look for text, let's say open source licenses. And these are all things that you should look at when you decide on the vendors that you use, whether it's open source or commercial.
Okay. What about Palameda? I think the question is, so why should we look at Palameda? And so it's Jeff, it's your opportunity to brag about Palameda.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that. So, obviously I have a strong preference for one tool here. We've been doing this open source discovery now since 2003. The things that I think make Palameda and now Flexera software special is a couple things. Well, first off is we have a ability to get a quick answer. You can put a code base into us, and for certain types of discovery, get some very quick, high quality data, dozens to hundreds of things automatically, especially if you're living in, say, the Maven space or the NuGet space or Node Package Manager space. Great way to get a good bill of materials. We also have the ability to look very deep. So organizations who are very concerned about Linux compliance, or they're very concerned about commercial SDKs or binary files that may be coming from the outside, they come to Palameda Flexera. They want to know what's been compiled into these binaries. Have a DLL. Is there OpenSSL hiding inside of it? They want to be able to look for cutting and pasting. Many other tools that are out there don't let you go to that level. They don't show you cut and paste results. Many other tools ignore things such as multimedia files like images or icons and sounds. And again, if you're doing full compliance, or you're very concerned about what people might be looking at when they look at your mobile app or your website and they see the icons that have been taken from another open source project, these are some things that I think we do very well. So fast scanning and deep scanning, an emphasis on binaries and multimedia analysis, as well as people very often come to us because of our professional services knowledge. We have people on my team that have been doing this for over a decade. We participate in some of the largest M&As in the world. We participate in some of the biggest baselining exercises where companies have said, tell us what's going on inside of our product. And we bring that expertise to the table as well. So not just the physical product and the support in using that product, but if you need a quick answer, if you need consulting around what does this mean, we have that experience and we love to talk about it.
Okay. Last question, what is the next step, or whom do we contact for demo and stuff like that, if you have more questions about it? Let me try to answer this and then I'll hand it over to Jeff. So we are partnered with Palameda, Augus, and I think we are good partners in terms of synergy because we come from the overall holistic information risk management perspective. So we kind of look at everything, including open source software and outside that, whereas Palameda is an expert in open source. So we make a good pair. You can reach out to us. We can help you with your open source as well as other stuff. But feel free to reach out to either of us. I mean, you can reach out to Jeff or Flexera and Palameda, or you can reach out to Augus and us. The best way to reach out to us is to go to our website and contact us, and we'll have the right people call you back. And let me, over to Jeff. Jeff, do you want to add something to it before we wrap it up?
I think you summed it up perfectly. I think we work well together. Contact your team or my team here. I think we both will handle that request very quickly and get right back to you. Our contact information is up here on the screen. I'm sure your contact information will be shared as well. You can email me directly or visit our website, and there's some forms you can fill in as well.
Okay, and we thank you so much. And before we wrap up, we will be sharing the recording in case you are not able to stay for the whole session. We'll be sharing the recording as well to all the registrants. And thank you so much. Thanks, Jeff, for this really informative session. And thank you for all the audience to having to stay up and listen to us. I'm sure you found it informative and valuable. If you have any feedback, do write back to us. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, how can we do it better next time. And thank you. You have a good day, have a good night. Thank you so much.